This is your final exam review, Part 3, Chapters 5 and 6. Chapter 5 is on memory, which is defined as the ability to store and retrieve information over time. Objective number 1 in this chapter asks you to explain the information processing approach to memory. This approach sees your mind as similar to a computer with input, processing, and output. The input is seen or is called encoding, and that's the process of putting information into your memory, organizing it in such a way that hopefully you'll be able to utilize it later on. Once the information has been put in, it has to be stored. The storage is the physical memory connections inside your brain, different types of memory being stored in different areas of the brain. The third part is retrieval. Retrieval, of course, is being able to retrieve or get information back out of your memory, finding it in storage and being able to pull it up and utilize it. Objective number 2 asks you to describe the functions and characteristics of short-term memory, and objective number 3 to describe the characteristics of long-term memory. The stage theory of memory describes 3 separate processes that occur during the memorization of information. Your sensory memory is basically the way in which you take information. It can be through your eyes, through your sense of touch, through your ears. It includes brief storage of this sensory information for a very, very short period of time, generally several seconds. Once it leaves sensory memory, information is incorporated into your short-term memory, where a small amount of information can be held, somewhere between 5 and 9 bits of information, for less than a minute. This short-term memory is also sometimes referred to as working memory. Working memory is actually the memory processes used within short-term memory. Whereas the sensory memory takes in a lot of information, you can see a lot of things at a time. Your sensory memory is very limited in terms of the amount of information it holds. Your long-term memory is where information is stored over the long period of time. It has an unlimited capacity. In other words, you can continue throughout your life to put more and more information into that long-term memory. Long-term memory can be subdivided into more than one category. Explicit or declarative memories are memories of knowledge or experiences that you can consciously remember and generally describe. This would include episodic memories like your first day at school, remembering what happened to you then, as well as semantic memories, memories of facts and concepts that you may have learned in school, for example. The memory of terms in psychology would be included in your semantic memory. Implicit memory is the opposite of explicit memory. Implicit or non-declarative memory includes experiences that are procedural in nature, things that you remember how to do but probably can't describe exactly. For example, most of you know how to ride a bicycle, but have a great deal of difficulty describing exactly what your muscles have to do in order to accomplish that. The same with swimming. Although you can do it, you can show someone, generally you have a great deal of difficulty describing just exactly what the various muscle groups in your body have to do in order to stay afloat in the water. Psychologists have been quite involved in measuring information in your long-term memory. One of the reasons for this is that people are interested in knowing how to study better, how to learn better, and how to be more likely to be able to retrieve the memories that have been put into their long-term memory. One measure of long-term memory is known as recall. Recall is a very sensitive measure of long-term memory. Free recall, for example, what's used on an essay test, simply asks you a question and asks you to pull all the information you know out of your memory and organize it in such a way as to answer that question. For example, discuss Thorndike's theory would be an example of an essay question that would be measuring free recall. Cued recall is not quite as sensitive. This might be measured, for example, through a fill-in-the-blank question. Thorndike proposed the law of, and all you have to do is remember one word. You still have to pull that word out of your memory, so it's more difficult than, for example, a multiple choice test, but cued recall does enable you to measure memory in terms of what words are actually there and able to be recalled in the person's memory. Recognition is a less sensitive measure of long-term memory. With recognition, you're simply asked to look at a piece of information and recognize whether you've seen it before or seen it in association with other pieces of information. In this case, a multiple choice question, Thorndike proposed the law of A, B, C, or D, simply asks you to look and see which one goes with Thorndike, the law of what. But the answer is right there in front of you, so all you have to do is recognize it. If the information's in your long-term memory, you have a much better chance of recognizing it than you do of recalling it with minimal cues. There are many possible causes of forgetting information that's been entered into your short-term memory or your long-term memory. Encoding failure results when you simply are not able to pull the information out of your long-term memory, even though you may be sure that you put it in there. You studied a piece of information very hard the night before the exam. The day of the test, you're unable to recall the information or even recognize the information. It's very possible that your method of studying resulted in the information being placed in a location where you simply couldn't find it during the testing situation. Although psychologists generally believe that long-term memories do not decay over time, information in your short-term memory does decay very quickly in a matter of seconds, usually 20 to 30 seconds, and information either has moved on to your long-term memory or has decayed and no longer remains in your short-term memory, unless you've been actively rehearsing or repeating it during that time. Interference occurs when similar information blocks the retrieval of a memory that you're trying to locate. For example, maybe you learned Spanish in elementary school, and now in college you're trying to learn to speak French. Those Spanish words interfere with your ability to learn the French, or if you've been practicing your French a lot, you may be unable to recall or retrieve the Spanish words because the French language is interfering with that. Motivated forgetting occurs when anxiety interferes with memory. We'll talk more about this in the chapter on personality. Retrieval failure occurs when you're simply unable to bring information into your working or short-term memory. For example, you remember somebody's name, you've met them before, you recognize the face, but when you come to talk to the person for the first time after not seeing them for a year or two, you just simply cannot remember the name. You know it's there. Once you hear it, you feel very embarrassed because you've met the person before, but you're unable to retrieve the information at the time you need it. This is retrieval failure. In slide 6, we covered objective number 4, explain the differences among recall, free recall, cued recall, and recognition. And in number 7, slide number 7, we answered objective 5, which was explain the causes of forgetting. Now in slide number 8, we turn to objective number 7, explain the functions of schemas in memory, and objective number 6, describe the process of reconstructive memory. Using your memory is not as simple as pulling something out of a drawer. Your memory is located in a number of different areas of your brain, so anytime you try to retrieve a memory, you're pulling together pieces of information about things you saw, a visual memory which may be located in one place, things you heard, an auditory memory located in a different place, what you thought about what you saw and heard, a cognitive memory located in still a third location, as well as how you interpreted what you saw. Your interpretations may be based on previous thoughts, biases, prejudices, ideas about a particular situation that you may have. All of this information is put together. Your memory is reconstructed. Because it's reconstructed, put together from a number of different locations, it's not like a video recording that is an exact image and auditory record of what you saw. Instead, it's a reconstructed image and is subject to biases, both that had to do with the memorization process and the retrieval or reconstruction process. This is one of the reasons eyewitness testimony is notoriously inaccurate. Your memory of an experience may contain details that are not true, it may distort things that are true, and you may forget things that are true. Memories, as noted previously, are not stored as video recordings. Instead, schemas are used in order to organize information into your memory. A schema is a pattern of knowledge that is used to help organize the information. For example, most of you have a schema of what's supposed to occur at a birthday party. So when you recall or try to remember what happened at a birthday party, you're trying to remember what did the cake look like, who was there, what games were played or what activities went on, whose birthday it was, what day it was that you were celebrating, and things like that, because those things fit into your perception of what occurred at a birthday party or what should occur at a birthday party. This is an example of a schema. In general, they help you remember, but they may also bias you, because if you went to a birthday party without a cake, you might still, 5 years later, remember the wonderful chocolate cake you had at that party, even though there wasn't a cake there, because that's what you expected to occur, or expected to be part of the memory. Objective number 8 asks you to describe several techniques you can use to improve your memory. One of the common techniques used is chunking. We use this a lot with phone numbers, for those of you who don't have all your phone numbers in your phone already. When somebody tells you their phone number, the first thing you do is chunk together those first 3 numbers, either 281 or 713, or sometimes 832. These enable you to remember, without using up a great deal of space in your short-term memory, what the prefix is, because they exist for you as a chunk. If you remember the 2, you know the 81 goes with it. You remember the 7, you know the 13 comes with it. Remembering things in groups increases the capacity of your short-term memory. Elaborative encoding occurs when you're putting information into your long-term memory. For example, perhaps originally you put your owner's manual for your car in a particular drawer in a desk at home. Now you've done your first oil change on the car, and in order to remember where you put the receipt for the oil change in case you should need it later, you put it in the same place that you put your owner's manual. You relate the new memory, where you put the receipt, to an old memory, where you put the old owner's manual. In this way, you're helping yourself to organize your information in your memory. Elaborative rehearsal occurs when you're studying or when you're organizing information in a meaningful way. For example, perhaps you're studying classical conditioning in psychology. You do it first of all by memorizing the meaning of the terms, then you go back and try to think of an example of when classical conditioning might have occurred to you. Then you relate it to other examples. For example, maybe what you're thinking about in reference to yourself was when you acquired a particular phobia because you were bitten by a dog. You relate that to other examples of other people you know who have phobias, perhaps someone who's afraid of horses, what caused them to be afraid of horses, someone who's afraid of bridges, what causes them to be afraid of bridges, and in doing so you organize information by elaborating on it and thinking more and more about it, making it easier to access during the time of a test because you have multiple routes to get back to that same definition or information about classical conditioning. Mnemonic devices are another way to help remember. Many of you, for example, as a child were taught the rhyme, 30 days have September, April, June, and November. All the rest have 31, except February, etc. In that way, you were able to remember some relatively meaningless information because it occurred in the form of poetry in an easy-to-remember rhyme. This is a mnemonic device. Overlearning occurs when you go past the point that you know the information. You've done your flashcards, you've gone through the deck perfectly, but you keep right on working with the information. By overlearning, Frequently, you're able to put the information in more solidly in more areas of your brain, and as practice makes perfect with any other skill, you're learning it better and more able to perform well on the test with that material. Spacing is also important in terms of studying. Distributed practice, where you study a little bit every day, enables you to better remember information than massed practice or cramming. Massed practice or cramming overtaxes the brain, tries to put too much through the short-term memory into the long-term memory at the same time, and results in a loss of ability to remember some of the information. On the other hand, distributed practice, studying some every day leading up to the test, is a better way in which to manage your chunks of information and put them in your brain at a reasonable rate. Chapter 6 is Lifespan Development, Development from Conception through Death. Objective number 1 asks you to explain the difference between cross-sectional and longitudinal research designs. These two research designs are the primary ways in which research is done on lifespan development. Cross-sectional research is done at one point in time when individuals representing several different age groups are compared with each other. For example, 1 year, 2011, you take a group of 3-year-olds, a group of 6-year-olds, a group of 10-year-olds, a group of 20-year-olds, and compare them all with each other in terms of perhaps cognitive function. Longitudinal research, on the other hand, follows the same group of individuals over a long period of time. For example, in the year 2000, you take a group of 3-year-olds. You study them again in 2003 when they're 6. You study them 5 years later in 2008 when they're, 11, and so on. This enables you to know that your research is actually looking at developmental changes rather than differences between children. When you study the cross-sectional design, the 3-year-olds are different people than the 6-year-olds, so differences between them may not just be a matter of maturation, but may be a matter of using different children. Longitudinal research, on the other hand, takes a long time to do. You lose subjects to various reasons during that course of time, and obviously costs a lot more money since you're forced to continue your project going for many years. Objective number 2 asks you to list the characteristics of the 3 phases of prenatal development. Prenatal development begins with conception. This is called the germinal period or the zygotic period. During the period between conception and implantation in the wall of the uterus, it takes approximately 10 to 14 days. During that period of time, the fertilized egg is referred to as a zygote, and as I mentioned, sometimes this is called the zygotic period instead of the germinal period. At the end of those 14 days, the organism is referred to as an embryo. The embryonic stage lasts from 2 to 8 weeks, and during this period of time, the major internal and external organs develop. For example, the heart, the lungs, the arms, the legs are all developing during this period of time, even though most of them are not functional during this period. Also during this period, you have the development of 3 support organs: the umbilical cord, which attaches the mother's blood supply to that of the baby's; the amniotic sac, that bag of waters that protects the baby from external influences and vibrations; and the placenta, which acts as a filter between the mother and the infant's blood supply. During the 3rd period, the fetal stage, the developing baby is referred to as a fetus. This lasts from 9 weeks until birth, and it's during this time that those organs that first originated during the embryonic period grow and mature, and the baby reaches a size that it can sustain life outside the womb. During this period also, the developing infant, the fetus, experiences sensory development and begins to display specific preferences. For example, they'll react to certain foods that the mother has eaten, either in a negative or positive way. Objective number 3 asks that you explain the effects of teratogens and other negative factors on prenatal development. A teratogen is defined as any harmful material affecting prenatal development. This can include, but is not limited to, drugs, alcohol, toxins, viruses, smoking, bacteria, environmental pollutants, and other harmful agents. These can affect the physical, behavioral, and mental development of the embryo, the fetus, and the child after birth. One particularly notable example is fetal alcohol syndrome. Alcohol is a teratogen that can cause physical abnormalities in the newborn, as well as both growth and mental retardation. In fact, it's one of the leading causes of mental retardation in the United States. As far as recommendations, physicians now recommend no alcohol use at all during pregnancy because of the possible consequences. Objective 4 asks you to describe the relationship between contact comfort and attachment. As you recall from reading in your textbook, Harry Harlow investigated the notion of contact comfort with infant monkeys, deciding that the infant monkeys preferred to spend their time with a terry cloth mother rather than a wire surrogate, even though the wire surrogate was the one providing nourishment. So the infant, according to Harlow, whether monkey or human, needed the contact comfort, the warmth, attachment with the mother, rather than simply to be fed by the mother. That bonding was based on physical attachment. The term attachment carries over to the infant's need to be with the caregiver. Although it's built on contact comfort, it goes beyond that and develops into an emotional relationship. So, contact comfort provides the basis for that emotional attachment between the infant and the caregiver. Stranger anxiety and separation anxiety are reflections of this attachment. Stranger anxiety refers to a fear of unknown people, separation anxiety to the fear that the caregiver will leave the infant. Objective 5 asks you to explain the differences among the secure, disorganized, or anxious, and avoidant patterns of attachment. Mary Ainsworth did research on attachment using something called the strange situation test, where an infant was brought with their mother into a room, a stranger and various toys were already there in the room. The infant's mother then left the infant, and the researcher observed what happened when the mother left and what happened when the mother returned. The securely attached infant was generally distressed when the mother left. They would cry and stop playing with the toys. When the mother returned, they would eagerly greet her, going to the mother for comfort, and subsequently start playing again. The avoidant child, the avoidant attachment, these children did not explore, kind of avoided or ignored the mother. When the mother left, they weren't particularly distressed, but they also didn't greet her when she returned. The disorganized or anxiously attached child had no consistent method of coping. They were hard to comfort even when the mother would return, and long term, these infants exhibited a disturbed pattern of behavior. Objective number 6 asks you to explain the difference between the social learning and the gender schema theory explanation of gender role development. Social learning theory basically relies on learning theory explanations, modeling or imitation, whether modeling or imitation of media or in-person role models, reinforcement for gender-appropriate behaviors. For example, the little girl who wears dresses and looks pretty gets reinforcement. The little girl who plays in the mud and wears jeans doesn't necessarily get that same type of reinforcement. Also refers to punishment. The little boy who wants to play with dolls, for example, and is punished by being teased or criticized by the father, is learning an appropriate gender role. Social learning theory therefore describes gender as a learned behavior, or gender roles as learned behaviors. Gender schema theory, on the other hand, talks about a more cognitive development. Gender here is an important category inside the brain of the person, and once the child figures out whether they're a boy or a girl, they try to figure out what that means and organize their behavior accordingly. They seek information about what girls do or what boys do and make that part of their personality or part of their expectations for what they're going to do. Piaget suggested that cognitively an individual uses schemas or patterns of knowledge or information to take in information about the world, to encode information. Taking in information according to existing schemas is known as assimilation. Sometimes the information doesn't fit an existing schema, and you have to use a new situation or experience in order to accommodate and change or add to your set of schemas. This was objective number 7. Describe the process of cognitive development as Piaget explained it. Piaget believed that children also went through a series of maturational stages in their development, and objective number 8 asks that you summarize the characteristics of each of Piaget's 4 stages of cognitive development. The first stage, the sensory motor stage, occurs during the first 2 years of the child's life. During this period of time, the child has not enough language to think linguistically, so they think with their experiences through the use of their senses. So it's known as the sensory motor stage. During this stage, the child acquires object permanence, the notion that objects continue to exist even when they're not part of his sensory input. During the pre-operational stage, between 2 and 7 years of age, the child is egocentric, seeing things from their perspective since they're just now learning about the world. They're symbolic, they utilize language, they think using mental images rather than logic, and they develop a theory of mind. Their theory of mind is generally egocentric, but they begin to think about how they think and how other people think. They also experience an increase in their ability to use language in their thought process. During the school years, 6 or 7 through 11 years, the child is in the stage of concrete operational development. Their thinking now becomes logical, in particular in reference to concrete situations, real-world situations, real-world skills. They develop the idea of conservation, the notion that if you don't add or subtract something, what you're visualizing or what you're counting remains the same. During the next period, formal operations, which can begin to occur at age 11 but usually doesn't until much later, the child begins to be able to do hypothesis testing, think logically about abstract reasoning, and scientific reasoning. Abstract logic helps the child develop a more adult perspective on the world. Objective number 9 asks you to summarize the characteristics of each of Erikson's 8 stages of psychosocial development. It helps if during your learning of these stages you try to visualize what the infant, the child, or the adult looks like and acts like. The first stage, trust versus mistrust, visualize a totally helpless, dependent infant who needs other people for security and has to learn to either trust or mistrust other people in his environment. The 2-year-old, the toddler, experiences autonomy versus shame and doubt. Autonomy is the sense of self-control. He's learning bowel control, bladder control, control of eating, dressing himself. But he's also developing a will, a sense of independence. And sometimes this produces some shame and doubt as he's not able to live up to the expectations of himself or others. The preschooler, early childhood, develops a sense of initiative. They initiate activities, they initiate relationships, play with me, why does this occur? They ask a lot of questions. They can experience a lack of assertiveness or punishment for assertiveness if people criticize their attempts to initiate conversations or to get their questions answered. They can develop a sense of purpose if people take them seriously. School-age child develops a sense of industry literally meaning to make or to do, a sense of competence in real-world skills. This occurs between 6 and 12. They can also experience inferiority if they're criticized for their attempts. The adolescent is in a stage of looking for developing an identity, selecting occupational roles, selecting relationship roles, or they can become very confused by all the decisions that confronts them. Who am I is the primary question to be answered by a teen. Intimacy versus isolation is the young adult. they form an intimate relationship with friend and romantic partner, or remain isolated. They must develop a sense of love to develop successfully, according to Erikson. In middle adulthood, the individual develops a sense of generativity as they raise their children and create or produce a meaningful impact on the future. Alternately, stagnation can occur when they're not doing anything meaningful, not contributing to the next generation, and doing meaningless work. In old age, ego integrity allows them to sum up their life and say, it was a good life, reflecting on what they've done, as opposed to despair. The sense of despair is pervasive. I've made mistakes. I haven't done what I wanted to. My life's been a waste. Objective number 10 asks you to explain the effects of the authoritarian, authoritative, and permissive parenting styles on children's development. This one is a little confusing. Authoritarian and authoritative sound a lot alike, but if you can think of authoritarian as being an authoritarian personality, somebody who has very strict rules, uses punishment to control their children. As a result, the children end up either rebelling against this type of restriction or very depressed because they feel like they can't rebel or they'll be punished. The permissive parenting style, although it exists in two different forms, generally produces kids that are out of control, wild, confused, and lacking in boundaries. These are parents who basically allow the child to do whatever the child wants to do. Finally, we have authoritative parenting. Authoritative parenting is the style that is proven to be most effective in middle-class America, although not necessarily cross-culturally. If you can think of authoritative as referring to a parenting style rather than a personality, you might be able to distinguish it more readily from authoritarian. Authoritarian, strict, authoritative. These are parents that communicate well with their children. They set standards, they set limits, but within those limits they allow the children to participate in decision making. Their children tend to be more independent, particularly as adults, happier, and more prepared to live in an American society where independent decision making is required. Objective number 11 asks you to explain Kohlberg's levels and stages of moral development. Kohlberg was a cognitive theorist. He talked about why an individual does what they do, not what they do, per se. Level 1, the preconventional level, consists of two stages, both very involved with self-interest. First, am I going to get punished for something? If so, it must be wrong. I should obey the rules so I don't get punished. And stage 2, what good can happen to me if I do this? If I steal this, will I get away with it? Level 2, conventional morality. This is where most adult Americans are. Stage 1 is social approval. What will other people think of me? And stage 2, the social norms or laws of my culture. I should do what's expected according to the law. Level 3, post-conventional morality, is achieved by very few individuals. This stage relies on the notion of social contracts or agreements, as well as universal ethical principles, in which the individual decides what the bottom line is for themselves and makes their justification or reasoning according to their own ethical system. And finally, objective number 12, describe the symptoms and proposed causes of Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease is a form of dementia. There are physical, mental, emotional, and social effects. The primary initial effects are to the person's memory. There's a gradual deterioration of memory over time, but as the person continues to lose cognitive function, they eventually lose the ability to remember who specific people are. They lose the ability to remember ultimately how to walk, how to feed themselves, how to dress, and their personality deteriorates at the same time. Possible causes includes genetics. Some types of Alzheimer's disease run in families. Potential environmental causes, heavy lead poisoning, for example. Diet, high-fat diet is correlated with Alzheimer's disease. Inflammation in the brain. also correlated with Alzheimer's disease. In specific, in autopsies they find amyloid plaques, tau proteins, and fibrillary tangles that exist because of these excess plaques based on the proteins. This is the end of Section 3, Chapters 5 and 6.